Hey, it's Nathan Selove from Oakcroft Films with another edition of Autism Actually Speaking. Hey everyone, today we got another interview with the remarkable Anthony Adams. He is a fellow forensicator, and he did a speech this year about neurodiversity with regard to race in the United States. And he brought up a lot of really interesting points, and I thought that this is an issue that we often ignore when talking about autism-related issues. So we're going to bring him here to talk about this a bit. So how are you doing, Anthony?
I'm pretty good. Thanks for having me on this show.
Yeah, of course. So what prompted you initially to start writing the speech? Like, was there a moment, or was it something you'd been thinking about for a while?
It's been something I've been thinking about for a while. It really came together when there was a story about a college student on the ASD spectrum who had been tackled and beaten by police after he strayed off course because he was a cross country runner. And it was at that point that it sort of dawned on me that being on the spectrum when you're Black is such a wildly different experience, but it is also an experience that doesn't ever really get covered except for in the context of violence.
Right.
So I figured at that point, if no one else was going to talk about it on the circuit, I may as well. So I ran it by my coach, and she gave me the green light for it. And at that point, I started writing it. In June, the June before the season started.
All right. So one of the things that you bring up, one of the things that you've talked about is that there's a massive discrepancy between diagnoses for white individuals and diagnoses for people of color. So would you say that is because there's an actual, like, biological discrepancy, or do you think it's sociological?
Oh, it's definitely sociological. Oftentimes people of color don't have access to experts who are actually good at providing diagnoses, and oftentimes what ends up happening is a child of color is exhibiting symptoms and they just get hand waved as just acting up, or they're labeled as being bad in classrooms. And more often than not, in my experience and the experience of people I've talked to, we're more likely to get beatings than actually getting a diagnosis. Because if you're stemming in class or you're not developing socially the way you're expected to, it's considered a moral failure more often than it is considered that you might be on the spectrum. And a lot of this has to do with just a lack of awareness on what being on the spectrum looks like, and stigma largely perpetuated by culture against being on the spectrum. It trickles down from sort of ableist culture, and then gets reinforced by the fact that resources are harder to come across when you're a person of color, and then on top of that is compounded upon racism, because at that point acting out is responded to with violence rather than with attempts at understanding, largely because it's very hard to view the Black body for a white society as anything other than violent.
Yeah. How old were you when you first got diagnosed?
I was 15.
15? Do you think that in your specific situation as a person of color that you were lucky to have it that early, or do you think it would have that it didn't happen earlier because you're a person of color?
I think, looking back at my life, I feel like I should have been diagnosed a lot earlier. I was exhibiting a lot of the symptoms. I just didn't know what being on the spectrum was, and no one ever bothered to get me screened. It actually took a teacher that I had in high school who noticed that I was having serious struggles socially, and pulled me to the side and said, you considered getting accommodations. I didn't know what that meant, and she asked if I had ever been screened for being on the ASD spectrum, and I said that I had.
Have you ever faced an instance, a clear instance of say someone not believing that you were autistic that you felt might have had something to do with your ethnicity?
Definitely.
Yeah.
After I got to Monmouth, a friend of mine, we were talking, and he calls someone Asperger's, and like I explained to him, like, that's not cool, like I have Asperger's, and he immediately responds with, well, you don't seem like the type of person who has Asperger's. You don't act like you're retarded, and we're not friends anymore.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
And it largely had to do with the fact that he just never met a person of color who was on the spectrum before, and on top of that, he just sort of assumed that because I'm not completely debilitated, the way culture sort of dictated, you must be if you're on the spectrum, that I must be perfectly fine. And then he went on this long tangent about how people of color self-diagnose too much and all that fun stuff.
Yeah. So, do you feel like in the forensics community and in a lot of communities, you often talk about intersectionalism, and how that often puts a person in a position of choosing between which marginalized identity that they're representing. Have you ever felt that, like that you had to choose between one of your marginalized identities?
Every now and again, it feels like, especially within activism and like Black Lives Matter and all that sort of stuff, it's really hard to convince people that the part of my identity that is on the spectrum matters. Like, it's hard to convince people that being on the spectrum is a core part of my identity, because I keep being told by neurotypical people who have no clue what it's like, stop using identity first identifiers for yourself. You're making things more difficult for everyone else. Stop talking like this. Like, that's not what we're focusing on right now. As if, like, I can just stop being on the spectrum because I'm Black. There's definitely, especially in progressive communities, a pressure to abandon whatever part of your identity is least convenient at the time.
Right.
Which is unfortunate.
Yeah. So I got one final question, which is kind of a two-part question. And this is more how do we get the conversation started? So so first I want you to talk about how people of color who are also on the autism spectrum can try to get that conversation started within their own community, and how can, say, people who are, how can white people on the spectrum sort of help keep that going?
Okay. If you're on the spectrum and you're a person of color, my best advice is, if you're comfortable with it, be upfront about it. Like, be out. Like, you can be proud of being on the spectrum. It's a part of who you are. With all the rhetoric about curing being on the spectrum, curing autism, and fixing people because there's something wrong with them, that rhetoric doesn't necessarily reflect the experience of people who actually are on the spectrum. The thing that most helped me was the fact that I didn't need to be ashamed of the fact that I was on the spectrum, and in addition to that, I didn't have to be ashamed of being Black and on the spectrum. As far as I'm concerned, those two are parts of me that are intertwined in a way that can't be removed. And I think the best way to start the conversation is to make it very clear that those two, being a person of color and being on the spectrum, are two things that are core parts of your identity. And at that point, make the terms of engagement very known. If someone's going to attempt to engage with race while ignoring the fact that you're on the spectrum, or are trying to convince you to pack it up because it's too inconvenient, then let them know that that's off the table. Basically what I'm saying is insist on your identity. There's nothing wrong with being pushy about demanding that other people accept and attempt to understand who you are. For white people attempting to understand the conversation and keep it going, one of the solutions in the speech was attempt to change the way you think about being on the spectrum. That means talking to people of color who are on the spectrum, and if you don't know anyone, then read stories about them. There's a wealth of information online that you can familiarize yourself with, especially for other people's identities and other people's narratives, that, quite frankly, we don't engage with very well, if we engage with them at all. If you can put a face on being a person of color and being on the spectrum, then it's a lot easier to keep the conversation going, because it's so much harder to dehumanize those people. And beyond that, call people out. Like, the one thing I've noticed from allies in particular is that when it's a friend that needs to get called out, they just don't. So if you're an activist for the rights and dignity of people on the spectrum, that inherently means you also have to be an activist and an advocate for the rights and dignity of people of color. If you're an activist or advocate for people of color, then that inherently means that you also have to be an activist for people on the spectrum. They're one and the same. There are people of color who are also on the spectrum. That also means demanding that the people you care about do better for themselves.
Well, I really appreciate this. This was an awesome interview. I think that you brought up a lot of really good input. You brought up a lot of really good insights. So thank you so much for joining us.
Of course, no problem at all. Really.
Yep. And remember, if you have any questions or topics you'd like addressed, please leave them in the comments below or message me on my Facebook, also linked below. And remember, if you can no longer use a fidget spinner to STEM in class because some guy named Chad wouldn't stop using it, you might be autistic.